That's it?
Yep.
Was that it, or was that you telling me what the signal is?
You're recording, so you're good.
Okay. They don't usually trim off those first couple seconds, so I should shut up and get started. So, my name is Jeff Mann. Welcome to the first official after lunch session, and I'm sorry, I'll try to keep you awake. I'll try to stay awake. Title of my talk today, depending on what audience I give it to, is either the state of cybersecurity today or the state of information security today, your preference. Just my vital statistics there. If by the end of the talk you want to get in touch with me, I can share this with you. I can share it'll be on the recording. I've got a few business cards if you want to talk to me, seek me out, ask me questions, or tell me I'm full of it and should retire, whatever it is. That's what I used to look like about 15, 16 years ago, back when I was cool and I actually had hair, and I fit in more with this group. Now I'm just an old bald guy. This is roughly the agenda of my talk today. I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am, since probably most of you don't know who I am, and it's not because I want to, I'm not all into myself and I want you to know all the great things I've done in my career, but the premise of this talk is I've been in the security business for quite a long time, and especially with what we call cybersecurity today, sort of the interweb and all that. It's been going on for about 20 some years, and I got my start, as we'll see in a few slides, about 20 years ago as a pen tester. I was asked to give a talk earlier this year, and this is the talk. I've been giving it quite a bit. I gave this talk in San Antonio back in February, and it occurred to me as I was putting this talk together, it had been 20 years since I first went to San Antonio to visit, at the time, an organization called the Air Force Information Warfare Center, which at the time was sort of the premier information security unit for the Department of Defense. So I went there to learn. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I've got slides and pretty pictures and stuff that talk about that. I'm going to talk about security today. Again, I put this talk together mostly because as an old-timer security professional and looking at all the breaches that have been in the news the last year or two, kind of got me soul-searching, really, about, gee, are we really doing things right? Are we really doing anything better today than we have been 20-some years ago? So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're failing. I'm going to talk about the solution. I will tell you what you need to do security right, and talk about the changes we need to make, and hopefully that'll spur some discussion so we can have some QA time towards the end. So I've been in the business a long time, 30-some years. Spent sort of the first third of my career within the DoD. And I've been out in the commercial sector for almost 20 years now. Started out as a pen tester back in the .com craze and did vulnerability assessments and security architecture work. Basically, I was a consultant, hired gun, to come in and help companies figure out where their insecurities were, where their vulnerabilities were. Very similar to, if you went to the afternoon keynote, the type of work that's still being done today. And then somewhere along the line, my lifestyle caught up with me, and I was sent to PCI purgatory. PCI is the payment card industry, and I spent 10 years as a qualified security assessor, or a QSA. So I was the guy that was called to come in and do the PCI audits, compliance audits. My DoD background, I actually got started at the National Security Agency as a cryptanalyst. And I was in what was called the manual crypto systems shop. The most secure crypto system in the world that cannot be broken is a one-time pad. Started with that. I was in an office that was producing one-time pads and other types of paper manual type crypto systems, which came in handy years later when I became a pen tester and wanted to do things like password cracking and stuff like that. So there was a tie-in there. Spent some time at NSA on what's called the operations side of the house, the offensive side of the house, what most people know NSA for, intercepting the communications of other adversarial countries, and if you believe the news recently, also our closest allies. Was there during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, which was that small skirmish that we had 10 years before this longest war we've ever had, which is, going on in Afghanistan right now. But then I got into an intern program as a cryptanalyst and ended up back on the defensive side of the house, what we called at the time information security or InfoSec, which is now I think they call it IAD, information assurance. And I was part of a group that was formed to do ethical hacking, what we call today red teaming, and was sort of in at the ground floor of that for NSA. Just because this is a hacker techie crowd, I wanted to throw in a few extra slides. At the very beginning of my career, one of the first, pretty much my first project was I was approached by a customer that was using a traditional one-time pad, and they said, we've got these computers on our desk. Isn't there some way we could use it to do this encryption, decryption process rather than spend hours writing it down on paper? Now, these were case agents that were comfortably in allied territory, but they were talking with people that were what we would call spies or turned agents that were back in those days in the Soviet Union. And they would have the one-time pad fit in the heel of their shoe, and they'd have to sneak their messages in and out. But the guy in the office had a big tablet. He had lots of luxury, lots of space to write. But even then, it took him hours to just create these messages or to decrypt these messages. So we came up with a project of turning a one-time pad into what we called a one-time floppy. We put the key and the digits and the characters that are written on a one-time pad are key, just like you can think about key today. The key is used to combine with plain text to produce a code. We put it on a floppy disk. To my knowledge, it was the first computer-based crypto system that NSA ever produced. And they really didn't like us doing it because NSA was all about building little black boxes. And one of my first advisors there said, well, there really is no such thing as software. All we do is firmware. So anyway, moved on. One of the other things I did was similar type of activity, only this was for U.S. Special Forces. They also used paper. One of the A-team members or the Delta Force members would carry a backpack with about 40 pounds of paper. They used a separate one-time pad for sending messages, and they used a separate one for receiving messages. And then they had another set of paper pads that gave them the call signs, the authentication that they used to say this is legitimate. And they were in the process of converting what they called their base stations, their communications base stations, to run on laptops. And that was saving them a lot of space, a lot of performance upkeep. But again, they needed to have the key that was essentially produced, put on a floppy disk, which is what we did for them. The way that the Special Forces guys used it was their algorithm, if you will, is something called a Vigenere square, which is simply the 26 slides of the alphabet against itself. And by doing that, you create unique 3-character combinations, or what we call trigraphs. And it turns out that when you do this, there's something like 123 unique trigraphs that are formed. And the Special Forces guys would memorize them. So when they were encrypting and decrypting it, they're doing it all in their head. I was working with them, trying to help them work on these systems, and I didn't have it memorized. So I just came up with this I've just been through the Crypto 101 history classes and learned about cipher wheels. So I said, there must be a way to make a cipher wheel that does the whole Vigenere thing. And I did it. I came up with one. The first one I made was on graph paper. I rubber cemented it. Does anybody remember rubber cement? When was the last time you saw rubber cement? Do they still make it? I was thinking about that the other day. I put it on cardboard. I put a little acorn pin in it, cut it out. So I took it with me the next time I went out to a Special Forces unit to talk to them and do some training. I'd turn my back to the people to write on a whiteboard, turn around, the thing's gone. They were stealing it from me. So I'd made some more, I'd bring them out. They kept stealing it from me. So we finally broke down and said, would you like us to make some of these things for you? So we produced like 15,000 of them and sent them out. And, that was like in the late 80s, and up until the last couple years. In fact, earlier this year I gave this talk, and somebody afterwards came up to me and says, I didn't know you made that thing. I've got one of those. So I always will run into former Special Forces guys, or I think they used them a little bit in the State Department, but they came to call it the Whizzy Wheel. So if I ever meet a Special Forces guy, I ask them if they've heard of a Whizzy Wheel. 9 times out of 10 they have, and I tell them that I invented it, and they either hit me at that point or they buy me a drink. So it's kind of cool. Anyway, for a while I was a cryptanalyst, and I was really excited. 2 summers ago, Wired magazine put out an article talking about some guy at CIA headquarters that cracked the code of this statue. It doesn't really show up too well here. Has anybody heard of this is called the crypto statue? It's in the courtyard at CIA headquarters. So early in 2013, they had an article saying that this guy at CIA headquarters had broken it tediously over like 10 years. And then a few months later, this article that came out and said that a bunch of NSA interns had taken the code down and taken it back to headquarters and broken it years before this guy from CIA headquarters had done it. So I am happy to say I was actually one of those interns. It's one of my favorite stories that I never got to tell until Wired magazine put it out in the public realm. But we were kind of offended that this statue was at CIA, because NSA is the crypto agency, not CIA. So anyway, we did take it back, and they actually, in the article, they had a copy of a memo. I had forgotten it, but there was a memo written by like the director saying, okay, you guys can work on this, but don't do it on company time, basically, and don't use any of the company hardware, all the super mainframes that we have that do all the statistical stuff. So we basically had to break it on all by hand. So that statue contains 4 separate messages. 3 of them were broken rather quickly. Nobody has ever broken the 4th one. It's not very long, so it's harder to break when you have less traffic to work with. So to this day, the 4th message has never been broken. So the entire message that the sculptor, the artist that created the whole thing, has never had his entire solution revealed. He'll probably take it to his grave, I don't know. But anyway, that's my days at NSA doing fun stuff, and then I ended up getting into pen testing and vulnerability assessments. That was also fun stuff. I mentioned that I went to AFWIC 20 years ago, and that was sort of the genesis of this talk. Back then, we didn't really call it red teaming. I think that term came along a few years later. But we did call it penetration testing. We talked about having penetration envy and all sorts of fun stuff like that. And one of the last things that happened while I was at NSA, we were trying to do some work for the Department of Justice. In fact, I just printed up some of these, some of the letters and the correspondence between the Department of Justice, an organization called DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, and NSA. And this, I'll share this just because it sort of sounds like it's related to the whole Snowden thing, in that NSA is not chartered to do what NSA does, or at least historically wasn't, to U.S. citizens, U.S. entities. So the idea of ethical hacking or red teaming or pen testing, for all the good benefits, for NSA to do something like that was kind of not something that we did. So we had this months-long process of getting all sorts of special permissions, and everybody had to review it, and lawyers, and this, that, and the other. And basically, the Department of Justice wanted us to come in to do some pen testing of their networks to tell them what their vulnerabilities were. And we were about 6 months into getting the authorizations, and we were this close to getting all the signatures and all the permission when I got a call one day saying, we've been hacked, and their website was defaced. Does anybody even remember this? It was one of the early ones. I want to say it was in August of 1996. Janet Reno was the Attorney General. They replaced her picture with a picture of Adolf Hitler. They had a link to the Playboy page. Playboy.com was brand new. Everything was brand new back then. Of course, they put the swastika up. I don't know if you can read. I don't even remember what George Washington said, but I think he said something about, I'm rolling over in my grave because of the state of security in the world today. Anyway, so I was involved in early forensics exercises. I mentioned Snowden because we actually got in trouble with our own lawyers, general counsel, because they were very concerned about we were doing this thing that NSA isn't allowed to do, even though we thought we had all the permissions and the paperwork. And he mentioned, this thing called the Church Act. Haven't you ever heard of the Church Act? You might have violated it. You could get the director thrown in jail, and so on and so forth. The only other time I've ever heard about the Church Act in history is when Snowden did his thing. They cited the Church Act. And the Church Act was basically, NSA did some things during the Watergate hearings, the time of the Watergate break-in, doing surveillance on U.S. citizens, and some congressman named Church called him out on it and created an act, a law that said specifically NSA don't do what NSA does to U.S. citizens. Have I bored you yet? Because I haven't even gotten to my talk yet. Anyway, so I got out into the private sector. I spent the first couple years doing consulting, attack and penetration testing, which really turned into vulnerability assessment, which really turned into security program architecture and development, because nobody was ready for a pen test back then, as the gentleman earlier was talking about. And somehow I ended up doing PCI, and I was there for 10 years. Doing the QSA work, trusted advisor, basically doing a lot of teaching and a lot of consulting. And 2 years ago, a little bit over 2 years ago, a buddy of mine from Tenable called and said, hey, do you want to be the subject matter expert for PCI at Tenable? Why don't you come on over? I did, and here I am telling you guys about the state of security today. So I'm one of the thought leaders, speaker, talking heads. Has anybody heard of Tenable? Okay. If you haven't heard, Tenable announced this week we just got a second round of investment funding, $250 million. It's a phenomenal amount of money to be invested in a very mature industry, vulnerability management. And I only mention this to say that we're doing a lot of hiring. If anybody out there is looking for a job, definitely check out our career page. We're hiring hundreds of people, all sorts of different positions. I mentioned I was a QSA, and I just want to put this up there to show the different companies that I worked for. I worked for a practice in the mid-2000s that, for whatever reason, we were the QSA group that was called in to help out the companies that had been breached in the mid-2000s, mostly by the Gonzalez hacking ring. So some of those names are up there more or less prominently displayed. I've been to lots of different types of companies, and this is just within the structure of PCI. Obviously retail, but there's also gas stations, banks, insurance companies, e-commerce companies, web companies, call centers, data centers. You name it, it's up there. There's a lot of diversity, and card brands themselves I've done work for. So the ones that are kind of huddled in the middle are the ones that were probably in the news in the mid-2000s. Hopefully you recognize some of those names. Not to pat myself on the back or anything like that, but just to say that even as a QSA, I've had kind of a unique experience, because there aren't a whole lot of people in the world that can say, oh, well, we were part of the team on the ground at Heartland days after their breach, trying to get them back into the good graces of PCI. So anyway, let's move on. Where do we stand today? Again, this is kind of a retrospective on 20 years of being in the information security, the internet security, InfoWeb kind of business. And again, I kind of started off writing this as sort of soul searching. Gosh, are we doing better? Because 20 years into it, what happens? We get these major breaches, and I probably need to update this with what was the latest one a couple weeks ago? TalkTalk. Unfortunately, we keep adding to the list of the breaches. But what's working? Phishing attacks are working. We still have issues with passwords, not only weak passwords, but shared passwords, and not only shared passwords, but default passwords, default settings. Does any of this ring familiar to you? It keeps us all in business if we're in the pen testing business. And then, to add insult to injury, some of the things that we've relied on for 20 years is the building blocks and the tools we use. Things like the bash shell. Turns out it has vulnerabilities in it that are 20 years old. And what's different today? Technology is obviously a lot faster. We're not just looking at hardwired networks anymore. We're looking at virtual networks. We're looking at everything's moving to the cloud now, and we're passing the buck on to a cloud provider and trusting them to be more secure because that's the business they're in. So we're outsourcing a lot of this. It doesn't sit well with me. I don't know how it sits with you guys, but it just kind of makes me a little concerned. You think about what are the motivations of the bad guys, what are the threats today, whether you call them hackers or not, or if you get hung up on the names. But obviously they've figured out a way to monetize the data that they're stealing. That's probably first and foremost. Whether they're doing it for political activism, hacktivism, or just simply to make a buck. The threat is real and it's certainly out there. And as a former pen tester, and what I always used to tell my customers, they've got infinitely more resources and time to do what they do than what you're giving us in terms of time to try to figure out what's wrong and try to protect it. So it's sort of the deck is stacked in the favor of the bad guy, if you will. So why are we failing? This is a little bit my opinion, but I think I believe in my opinion because I've been in the business so long, but I think overall in this industry or in the business world, there's this over-reliance on technology. Companies don't have the skills and the training, they don't have the people. That's one of the buzzwords around the industry these days, the hacker community, the security community. There's a labor shortage, there's not enough people out there that know what they're doing. So there's this, for many reasons, there's a reliance on technology. And you might have heard it said that there's no such thing as a silver bullet solution. And I believe that and I ascribe to that. But what companies have done too often is they've gone out and bought every silver bullet they can find. So they end up with a whole magazine full of silver bullets. And so they have all these things and they think that makes them secure. Now, this list is a little bit biased because it's just strictly because I've had PCI on the brain for so long. This is kind of a list of things that you need for PCI compliance to cover all the different security requirements. But 20 years ago, when companies were starting to get on the internet, it was, we have to have a firewall. And shortly after that, it was, well, you need to have intrusion detection, or you need to have a pen test, or you need to have vulnerability scanning, or you need to have, what is it today, the big ones, a SIM solution. You need to encrypt your data. You need to have two-factor authentication. You need this, you need that, you need this. And companies buy it. They go out and buy all this stuff, and where does that leave them? I don't know, but big companies are still getting hacked and still getting breached. So what makes a network insecure, to my way of thinking, is sort of a combination of they've got all this stuff, but very often, and I've seen this time and time again as I've gone into customers and I've asked them, okay, what's the strategy here? They don't know. They don't have a written information security policy. And by that I mean they don't have a plan. They don't have a strategy. Very often companies, they know they need to do something, but they haven't really thought out what is it I'm trying to protect and where is it and to what degree do I need to protect it. You can argue whether compliance programs are good or not, but the PCI, again, as an example, has done nothing, if else, taken a whole lot of companies that wouldn't ordinarily have done a whole lot for security in general, and they've forced them to become more secure just because they've forced them to understand a little bit more what's going on in their environment. And that's really the push of PCI these days. So it's a gimmick to get out of the business of PCI by de-scoping things. But to de-scope things, you have to know where things are. So there's sort of this inverse relationship, and there's this hidden benefit, whether it's intentional or not, of if you want to remove the scrutiny of PCI, you've got to identify all the sensitive data in your network and either remove it or isolate it. To do that, you have to understand where it is. So all these companies that are trying to get out of the business of having to do this burdensome PCI thing are cleaning up their network. And 10 years ago, 11 years ago, when we first started out doing PCI stuff, the data was everywhere, and it wasn't encrypted. And it was walking out every day on laptops by conscientious people trying to do work at home, and they're plugging into their home networks and so on and so forth. I talk about the lack of commitment to security. It's almost like it's almost like ignorance and it's almost like apathy. And everybody knows the difference between ignorance and apathy. I don't know and I don't care. Depending on what industry you're in, and again, PCI is an example, they only do what they have to do because PCI tells them to do, and they try to limit it. You think of the healthcare community, some of the big breaches this year were healthcare companies. If you read the articles about what was stolen, it wasn't technically healthcare information that was stolen. So they might have been doing a great job of protecting the healthcare data. Might have been fully HIPAA compliant, doing all the right things, doing everything they had to do, but somehow these companies collectively were missing the ball on, they still had sensitive data and they weren't protecting it in a way that needed to be protected because they weren't looking at it from a different perspective. So that all ties back to, what's your game plan, what's your strategy, what is it you're trying to protect and why? And of course, I talk about decentralized administration. I don't know if you guys work for commercial companies or if you're working for consulting companies, advisory companies, but you probably are familiar with silos and how different groups are not talking to one another within companies, and it happens within our industry as well. I would very often go in to do a PCI assessment, and you have to talk about the firewalls and the network. So you talk to the network guys, and you get the network architecture, you get the wire diagram, and you'd find out where everything is, and then you'd ask them, okay, well, where are all the sensitive servers? Where's all the data on the network? And they'd shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know, I just set up the network. I don't know where the sensitive zones are. So then you have to go to the server guys to find out how the servers are being built. And so you'd have to talk to the Unix guys, and maybe it's the Linux guys, or maybe it's the Windows servers. It was a different set of people. And you talk to them about how they're building the servers, how they're hardening the OS, and they talk about that all day. And then you say, well, what kind of, what apps are running on the servers? What kind of data is on the servers? Shrug their head. I don't know. I just keep the OS running. So on and so forth down the line. Even DBAs, they talk all day about the schemas and the structures of the databases that they're in charge of, but start asking them about what kind of data is in the databases. I don't know, I just set up the schema. So there's a lot of willful ignorance is what I like to call it. I'm just doing my job, I'm just staying within my lanes, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, my light is green, so I don't have to worry about it. I think those all contribute to why some of these big companies are failing. And by failing, I mean they're getting breached. So on the flip side of that, what does that mean we need to be doing? We need to sell the idea of security better, both as an industry and both within companies. And some of these ideas, and this is sort of this is a collection of my thoughts and my impressions more than anything. But selling the companies on what are the financial losses or what are the financial inefficiencies, because usually it comes down to dollars and cents. You can save money if you do this, or you can theoretically save money by preventing this from happening, those types of things. When you start talking money, that's usually when the management and the executives start to pay attention. And certainly when they see it in the news, having happened to another company that's just like them, or just like you, or just like us, that's when they start to listen. So what do we need to do? What really needs to be done? How do we solve this problem? I am more and more convinced that what really makes a difference holistically is education and awareness. More people need to be aware of what security is all about, what it is and isn't within an organization, and that ties into understanding that security is not a state that you achieve, it's something that you do. I like to say that security is a verb, it's not a noun. And understanding that means you're involved necessarily in an ongoing life cycle or process. You as a company are engaged in this, and how you begin to get secure is first understand where you are in the life cycle, and then proceed from there. And this is not meant to be a speech on security, but traditionally it starts with an assessment. Where are you? Establish a baseline. Where is the sensitive data? What are our critical business operations? Who has access to the data? What third parties are we allowing to come in and come out of our network, and where? What have we outsourced? What do we own? Who's responsible? Who's liable? And take all that information, then build your strategy, build your plan, and write it down. That's necessary, the policy aspect of things. And then build your solutions based on that, based on having an idea of what you're dealing with, based on having a plan. Implement it for a while, run with it, and then test it. That's when that dirty word audit comes up. Audit is measuring what you're doing against some sort of set of rules or guidelines or standards. People always call PCI an audit. It's not an audit, it's an assessment, because it's designed to be a security professional, a QSA, coming in and just doing a baseline of where you are. Now, you do that several times and it starts to look more like an audit, but the audit aspect of PCI is you should have a configuration standard for all your servers, but PCI doesn't stipulate what the standards are. It says use one. So you have to come in and find out, well, what one are you using, and then measure it against that. And it's ongoing. As soon as you're done auditing, and it kind of blurs between auditing and assessing, you're constantly refining and updating, and new vulnerabilities are exposed that feed all this. This is really, in some ways, the definition of a risk assessment. I have no idea what I'm doing for time. What's the time check?
You got 20 minutes.
Oh, plenty.
15, 20 minutes.
Okay, plenty of time. So, intent, having a system, having a systematic approach, having intention of designing and understanding where you are, that's really the heart of what I'm trying to say is what's needed. And that necessarily needs to be written down in the sense of you don't need to have this, shelf full of documents or, a file system full of PDFs of what your policy is. And I used to see this all the time. PCI requires your policies to be reviewed annually. So I would very often come on site and the 50 documents had been reviewed one day the week before I got there. All of them on one day had the same date. Yeah, I knew that they weren't really reviewing critically what the thing said and updating it. They were just changing the date. And sometimes I'd let that slide and sometimes I wouldn't. But the understanding that you need to have it written down, you need to have it embraced by your entire company to the appropriate level. Ownership, having everybody understand what their role is and how they fit into everything. And then understanding ultimately that it's not just what technology solutions, what security solutions do we need to have in place, and then we can sit back and say, okay, we're done, we're protected. So let me blow through this. What is an information security policy? I've kind of been describing it. It's your plan, it's your strategy, it's a way to justify expenditures, it's the way to decide if you're investing in this or that. Do you need one of these or three of these, or who gets what? It's a way to go before your whoever your budget committee is within your company to justify not only the investments, and technology is necessary, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you can't do it without technology, but understand what the role of the technology is. Understand that the technology is ultimately a tool, but a well-informed workforce and staff, especially within your IT group or your security group, is ultimately what changes things. But a lot of people think, well, security policy, that's just writing. I mean, if you're a developer, how much do you love documenting the code that you write? Nobody likes to write stuff down. I think that's a universal truth. In the early days, we talk about policies, and the firewall rule set in the early days was referred to as the firewall policy, the configuration. Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that overall guide, that overall strategy that dictates how everything is accomplished and how everything is implemented. As I said, a policy helps you build a business case. Companies are businesses. Most businesses are run by people that understand business and business processes. So putting the need for security within your company in the language that the business people understand is key. And again, the compliance requirements really help. I used to come in and just whisper, hey, I know what's wrong with your network more than I do. What do you need? Because if I slap PCI on it, guess what? You're going to get it. And they're like, really? I'm like, yeah, really. Test me on this. And so we'd test it, and they'd get it, and they're like, oh, you're my best friend, because I had this magic cape that if I said they needed something, the management didn't understand, but they said, PCI, we want it to go away, blank check. Well, you can have whatever you want. So that's a little trick you can do, hopefully, internally as well as if you're in a consulting role. when you have it written down, when you have a strategy, when you have a framework, everything kind of runs more efficiently and everything works better and things start to happen. And again, I can't emphasize enough, it's not all about just throwing technology at the problem. Why policy efforts fail? Because nobody does everything that I've just been describing, basically. That's my synopsis of that. I'm trying to keep moving. The keys to success: changing the corporate culture. I was talking to a healthcare crowd a couple weeks ago, and they were saying that's the number one problem within the healthcare industry, is convincing doctors that they need to have a password, and they need to use it, and they need to change it, because doctors are not accustomed to being told what to do. So they've got this incredible culture problem within the whole industry that they're trying to shift. They know they want to, they know they need to, they don't want to be the next Anthem of the world, but they're still faced with this corporate culture, this cultural problem of, we don't want to do security, it's too hard, or it's too inconvenient. So there needs to be buy-in from the top down. The line employee, the regular workers within a company, they need to see it being done by their bosses and their executives, because if they're not walking the walk, they know, it doesn't really matter. And that means the CEO can't turn over his password and his email accounts, or these days it would be his mobile device or his tablet, to his secretary or his executive assistant, and let her have access to it, and let her take it all over the place and rely on her to keep it secure, so on and so forth. So, the first question to ask yourselves if you're working for a company or if you're advising companies is to try to identify where you are within this life cycle so you can proceed from there. Now for my punchline. The heart of this presentation that you've just seen is verbatim a presentation that I gave when I first came out into the commercial world 18 years ago. Haven't changed a thing. Threats and motives, nothing's changed. Life cycle, nothing's changed. So now I ask you, and this is where we hopefully get into a conversation and a dialogue, if nothing's really changed, what needs to change? And I'm not saying I was cornering the market on thinking this is where security needs to be 20 years ago. The industry was saying all of this 20 years ago. Security practitioners have been saying this all along. Nothing has ever changed. So, again, this is my opinions and trying to sum up a lot of ideas and a lot of frustration of, gee, how as an industry do we do better? But I think if you're in a consulting role or if you're within your own company, you need to help try to understand and identify first what the problem is. And that sounds so basic, but a lot of companies I've been to, they don't understand what it is that they're trying to protect or what it is that they're trying to protect against. They know they need a this, they know they need a that. Why? I don't know why. Because I need to check the box. Within our security industry, I think we're culpable because most of the security industry is driven by vendors, and vendors are selling solutions. And do I say it on this slide or the next slide? But vendors lie. I used to see that all the time as a consultant. And then I became a vendor, and I realized, well, it's not always the vendors are lying. Some of them are conscientious and well-meaning, but they're as ignorant and uneducated and uninformed as everybody else. So they think they're saying the right thing. They think they're doing the right thing. They're using the buzzwords, or to put it in 2015 terms, they've got the latest logo of the latest vulnerability, so they think they're solving the problem. We need to break down we need to break down what the problems are to simple issues that can be digested. And security is not really that complicated. It means you have to be paranoid, and you have to assume that things are going bad, and you have to watch your network, and you have to know everything that's going on so you can see when something weird is happening, because the something weird probably means something bad is happening. And we need to communicate more within the industry, within companies. We need to break down the silos and the stovepipes. We need to stop thinking, well, my light's green, and so I don't care whatever else is going on. No, you have to understand you play a role in an ecosystem, and maybe you're a cog in the machine, but you're an important cog in the machine. There it is, vendors lie, and it was in here somewhere. Everybody's selling something, and this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, this whole security industry, that's mostly predicated on buying and selling technology solutions. There's a little bit, and I come from the consulting side of, there's also buying and selling advisors and the education and the awareness. And I have a bias, but I think that's what we need more of. We need more educated consumers making the smart purchases and the smart investments, and also being able to smartly use the technologies that they necessarily have to buy. So again, define the problem, education and awareness. I think those are at the top of the list, which is all just, we need to talk, we need to educate others. You guys know more than I do. I know something about something that you don't. Let's keep talking. That's why BSides things are so great. But we're still sort of this one little silo within a community. You need to go out and talk to the IT guy. You need to talk to the DBA. You need to talk to the business person. And we need to stop calling everybody that doesn't understand it the way we do stupid or ignorant or uninformed, and educate them. Because there was a time when we didn't know it, probably. I think there's a certain amount of ownership that we need to take as an industry and take responsibility for our role of action or inaction in why we've gotten to this place. So again, security is a verb. It's a lifestyle. It's something we do. And it starts with you. Be the change that you want to be or you want to see. Set aside there's not too much arrogance or anything like that in this industry. But we need to be humble and we need to teach. We need to, if somebody doesn't know, explain it to them. And explain it to them in a way that they can understand it. And the best way to learn to communicate is to first shut up and listen. I've learned. People talk about this whole industry being a game, and gaming is certainly a huge part of the industry. I tend to think of it more of a puzzle, because puzzles have solutions. There might be more than one solution. There's not always one size fits all solution, but there's usually a solution out there to whatever the problem is, or the puzzle. And the puzzle is not just how do we fix a problem. The puzzle I'm talking about is how do we fix this industry. There's ways to do it, and I'm not saying I have the right answer. I'm saying I have ideas of what I think is where we need to be going. Good communication, building trust. It's going to take time, and so on and so forth. Questions, comments? Wake up. Yes, sir.
I just had a comment more or less. You're saying that security, I was kind of thinking of a paradigm of the police academy movies, and you know how Lieutenant Hooks was always the soft-spoken person until she got really upset and then she started to be more voiceful. And I always think that security now is always that her character of, I'm going to be soft-spoken and security. And you kind of made it like a presentation of, yeah, let's, be a little bit more voiceful and loud about, our jobs, because a lot of people don't care about security. It's all about dollars, or it's all about just, we don't care. If somebody hacks us, it hacks us, or, Snowden comes around and says all this crap, and yeah, it happens. And yeah, I kind of wanted to make that point that you've made that, go out and be more voiceful and say, hey, we got to care about this, because down the road, you want to avoid those things, and if you do, then you make more money.
Right.
You don't have these problems.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the biggest soul searching I've been doing over the last year and a half is like, is any of this worth it? I like to think that I go into a customer and I make a difference because I come away, they're a little bit more secure. Not that they're secure, but they're not going to get hacked tomorrow. Knock on wood, none of the companies that I worked with, over the last 10, 12 years have been in the news recently. Now, unfortunately, a lot of them were my customers because they had the week before been in the news. Far and away, too many companies get it. They get religion because they get breached, and then they start doing things. Then the purse strings open up. So I'm fighting this feeling of why am I even bothering? What's it all worth? But I haven't given up yet, and I think we truly need to do something different, because we've been talking as an industry about we need to do something different for 20 years, and we're still doing the same thing. Yes, sir.
So, do you think, as a QSA, that PCI DSS is doing enough? I mean, we all know, or we all feel we know that it's a basic kind of security. We've seen companies that have had PCI assessments performed, and yet they've been breached. And so are they doing enough, and should they be doing more? And what is the value of having an ASV and not something along the lines of having some sort of certified pen tester? Because I think we all get into where pen test means a lot of different things.
Right.
And I think a lot is happening with the checkbox pen test. So any thoughts on that?
So let me rephrase the question for the for impertuity, for preservation's sake. Is the PCI DSS really doing anything good? Is it worth it, or should companies be doing any other things?
Doing more.
Should be doing
I think
more.
There's some worth there, but
So,
doing more.
I actually do have a very strong opinion on that. I think one of the nuanced difference, I think the PCI data security standard as a security framework is outstanding. Does it need a little bit of refreshing? Is it keeping up with the changing in technology? Not necessarily. I'd say no. But as a foundational security framework, it's covering all the bases. What has been done with PCI in terms of enforcement is where it becomes viewed as a bare minimum approach. In fact, I'm getting ready to write a blog and probably make a few enemies. The new director of the PCI community meeting, he was quoted as saying it's just a point in time assessment. I think that's a bunch of crap, because if you're actually doing what the PCI standard says, if you're actually compliant with it, that means you're looking at logs on a daily basis, which necessarily means probably you're using some sort of technology solution that's automating it for you. You're doing patch installation within 30 days of release of the patch. You've got a vulnerability program that's looking for vulnerabilities. Nobody does that. Everybody relies on the scanners, right? I work for a scanning technology company. Or you wait for the vendor to come out with the patch, and that's where the fire drill starts. But, so the second part of your question is vulnerability scanning or an ASV versus a pen test. I would love to have had a panel discussion with the keynote beforehand. And I have a presentation that I talk about pen testing. If somebody drops dead, I can fill in and give it to them later this afternoon. In this day and age of pen testing, nobody ever defines what it is. What is a pen test? What's the purpose of a pen test? What a pen test typically is, 99% of the time, is it's a vulnerability assessment. I personally believe, because I used to be the guy that said, I found the same problem I did the last time, years before. Well, that could mean they're not doing their job. It could also mean you as a pen tester aren't doing your job either, because you're not educating and providing the justification for making the change. But in today's age, a pen test should really be not vulnerability based at all. Because take PCI as an example. You've secured your network, you've secured your systems, you have patch management in place, you've got vulnerability management in place, you're doing an annual risk assessment, you're scanning at least quarterly, and they're saying you get a clean result at least quarterly, which necessarily means you're scanning more often than that. You're doing an annual pen test. You're doing all these things. Where was I going with that? My head. And so you get to the pen test. The pen test shouldn't be finding a default password. That should have been picked up already. It shouldn't be finding a misconfiguration. That should have been picked up already. It shouldn't be finding the missing patch. That should have been picked up already. What a pen test is always supposed to have been is you've put the secure things in place, and then the pen test is used to find out what you're missing or to connect the dots on things that are necessarily out there. So essentially, a pen test should be threat-based. It should be emulating what the bad guy is trying to do to break into your network, and can you detect them and can you catch them? So it should all be about the threat. It shouldn't be vulnerability-based at all. If you're a pen tester and you're writing a report and your result is you're missing a patch, I'm saying that's a bad pen test. Your result should be you've got a broken process that's allowed a system to be out here without this patch being installed that's been out for 750 days or whatever it is. And what's wrong with your process for the last 3 years that didn't detect that this patch was missing?
But I think there's also a fundamental problem. Sorry,
It's okay.
questions. There's a fundamental problem really with, a client going out and hiring directly for a pen tester when the client controls the rules of engagement.
Yep.
Because a pen test should really show real business risk.
Yes.
And if the client says you can only look at this one aspect and you can't go further and pivot, then you...
Well, and I haven't pen tested in a long time, but as a QSA, I had to review a lot of pen test reports. I used to get into arguments with my own company's pen testers because one of their favorite findings was, and it was a critical finding, was they found an FTP server. I'm like, well, did you exploit it? Well, no, I just found it. It was the Nessus result. And I'm like, okay, I know that FTP is an open protocol. I know that there's historically problems with FTP servers. I used to exploit them. But did you? Have you, they've kind of come a long way. And in fact, in the early days, the FTP was a good target as a server because it contained all the users and passwords, user IDs and passwords for the domain, for the network. So if you could knock over the FTP server, which had lots of vulnerabilities, or if you could scan or sniff the traffic, the logins, you were getting the credentials to get into the domain. Most companies don't run them like that anymore. Most FTP servers are sandboxed. Most, and of course not all, but again, you should know not to use your same password on an FTP server as your domain password. Doesn't mean people don't do it, but if that's a finding, if you've exploited that, that's something where you go back and say you've got a broken process because you're not educating your users to keep them separate. Time's up? Okay. Let me move on. Are there any other questions? We can take this up at the later on. Yes, sir.
All right, so you had a slide that you showed in '98.
Yes.
So with that being said, we're almost 20 years. What improvements have you seen in 20 years? Like, is the BSides community and the community coming together at an improvement? Is there more dialogue?
I think this is a potentially good thing, and the fact that a different set of people that don't usually have a voice are getting together and talking about things, I think is a good thing. I think we need to learn more about what the different is, because all I keep hearing from the keynotes is the same old, we're doing things poorly, we need to do things differently, but it's always from this sort of perspective that the be-all, end-all is the pen test. It's the hack. And truly, if you've ever felt it, the commercial world, the business world, they don't care what we're saying because they're making money hand over fist, and they're willing to pay the price of the occasional pop here and there. I was at a risk seminar last year where somebody from Visa stood up, and part of his presentation was, he said, it costs Visa 4.5 cents in terms of fraud loss for every $100 that's transacted on a Visa card. And I'm sitting there thinking, I would pay a nickel for every $100 I spent to not have to do all this. Who wouldn't? And it's like, why are we even bothering? Of course, Visa spends gazillions of dollars on fraud prevention to get that number down, but that's what they've gotten it down to. It costs them a nickel for every $100 that's transacted on a Visa card. So, as a quick plug, and we'll wrap it up, my next talk that I'm doing in the evolution of my thoughts, and I hope to do it at a couple BSides next year, is an attempt to teach us, this community, how to communicate and get our point across better. Because we're great at talking amongst ourselves, but we don't typically do too well talking to what I've heard somebody refer to as the muggles, which again is something we need to stop doing. We need to learn how to speak the language of business. You've heard that up front, but I'm going to give a talk on it just based on my 20 years of going into companies and having to talk to all sorts of different types of people. And then ultimately I'm trying to put together a training course. And my first experience at NSA, that thing that I was talking about, building a computer-based encryption system, NSA had never done that before. So I'm 25 years old having to pitch it to essentially the board of directors of NSA, explaining to them why it was a good thing to do and how we could do it securely and how it was okay for us to proceed with that. I've never looked back from that. I can talk to anybody, any group, because as a 25-year-old, I was pissing my pants up there in front of all these suits, gray-haired, much older. Of course, they're my age now, or I'm the age of them at this point. But, that was scary for a 25-year-old to do. How many of us have the opportunity to get up and speak in front of a group? This is a great place to start. That's one of the reasons why BSides exists, is to give everybody an opportunity to just stand up and speak, learn how to talk to a group, to individuals. There's a lot of really smart people around here with a lot of great ideas that and as a group, we don't often get heard by others. And there's reasons why that is that I think we can get beyond. And again, it's education, it's awareness, and it's training, and it's opportunity. So I think I'm probably blown past the time, so thank you guys. And hopefully we'll hang out at dinner tonight and talk more.